Welcome back, everyone. I hope that everyone had a good, hearty lunch, and I would like to apologize once again for the delay for about 20 minutes. We shall now begin Plenary Session 2 under the title of Public Policy, Growth, Sustainability, and Stability of Society for Job Creation. This session will be moderated by Mr. Kim Min-jun, the president of the Korean Economic Association. We have everyone in place up on the stage. I would like to invite President Kim up on the podium.
Let me extend my gratitude to the organizer of this conference. In this session, we have three distinguished speakers and two distinctive commentators. Let me first ask Professor Feldstein to give his speech. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Feldstein. Professor Feldstein is currently the George Baker Professor of Economics at Harvard University and the President Emeritus of National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Feldstein was born in New York and completed his undergrad education at Harvard University with summa cum laude in 1961 and received his PhD from University of Oxford in 1967. In 1977, Professor Feldstein received the John Bates Clang Medal of the American Economic Associations. Professor Feldstein served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the NBER from 1978 through 2008. From 1982 to 1984, Professor Feldstein served as Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisor and Chief Economic Advisor to President Ronald Reagan. He has also been a member of Washington-based Financial Advisory Board, the Group of 30, since 2003. On February 6, 2009, Feldstein was announced as one of U.S. President Obama's advisors on the President's Economic Advisory Board. Professor Feldstein has to leave in the middle of this special session. So after hearing his speech, we will collect comments and questions from the audience first. Please, Professor Feldstein, give big hands.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be back here, to be participating once again in a Global Human Resources Forum as I did a year ago. It's always a pleasure for me to come to Seoul. I've been coming here since the mid-1980s, so I've seen the remarkable transformation in this country, and it's an honor to participate in this session. As you know, the organizers have asked us to speak about public policy for growth, sustainability, stability, and job creation, which is certainly a very timely topic as the global economy struggles to recover from a really worldwide recession. Korea has done very well in every aspect of this subject. Growth, well, per capita GDP increased here at about 6% a year in real terms since I first visited here in the 1980s, which has meant a more than fourfold increase in real per capita incomes during that period. The recent cyclical recovery has been very impressive, one of the strongest of any country in the world. And Korea continues to create jobs, not just numbers of jobs, but good jobs. But it's useful to ask what kinds of policies are needed to continue superior performance now that Korea is a major industrial nation. Let me start with the subject of long-term growth, the rise in gross domestic product, or GDP. When we think about that, it's important to distinguish between the growth of potential GDP and the growth of actual GDP. Of course, we experience fluctuations in actual GDP that in turn reflect changes in demand. demand for exports, demand from consumers, demand in the form of business investment. Public discussions and the press often refer to these cyclical changes as growth. So we would read, the Korean GDP increased at 10% in the recent quarter, and some would say, well, the Korean economy grew at 10%. But of course, it's not sustainable at that pace. It reflects an increase in demand and a catching up, a using of existing capacity. When I think about growth, I think about sustainable, long-term growth that involves increases in the economy's potential, the increases in the potential to produce. And that has been the key to Korea's long-term increases in GDP and to the rising standard of living. What determines an economy's potential GDP, its capacity? Well, there are four major things. First is the capital stock, meaning the business equipment, the structures, the infrastructure, airports, ports, roads. Capital drives productivity, and it increases the amount that each employee in the economy can produce. The second, directly relevant to the subject of this entire conference, is the quality of the labor force. The third is technology, and the fourth is management. So let me talk about each of these, because increasing each of these ingredients contributes to the economy's capacity to produce, and therefore to potential GDP and sustainable growth. So the challenge for public policy is to design ways to increase each of these four. I'll start with the goal of increasing the capital stock, that is, increasing net investment in business equipment, business structure, and in public infrastructure. The key to achieving that is an increase in national saving. Without a high level of national saving, a country cannot sustain a high level of investment. And that saving includes the saving of households, of businesses, and of governments. Koreans are naturally high savers, one of the highest savings rates in the world. And a high level of saving can be encouraged by favorable tax policies. Economists recognize that taxes should, as a general rule, focus on earnings, that on wages and salaries, and on consumption, rather than on interest and dividends and other returns to saving. So good tax policy is also good for household saving. Business saving out of corporate profits is also a function of tax rules. A low tax rate at the corporate level leaves more profits for businesses to save or to distribute in the form of dividends. Profits that are saved inside a company lead to increases in the value of the company and therefore in its share prices. And those increases in share prices get taxed when investors sell those shares. So a low tax on capital gains encourages firms to retain earnings and to invest them in the business. Finally, there is government savings, or more accurately, government dissavings, a fiscal deficit. Every government in the world now is dissaving. Every government is now spending more than it collects in taxes. So even when private savings, including household savings and business savings, are high, large government deficits, large fiscal deficits, can absorb that saving and leave too little for productive investment in business equipment and structures. This is now a very serious problem in the United States, a problem which I hope is going to be solved during the years ahead. But it's also not as big a problem, but nevertheless a problem here in Korea, where this year the fiscal deficit is more than 4% of GDP. Looking ahead, potential GDP growth of every country, of every region, will be inhibited by high fiscal deficits. So a priority for policy everywhere in the coming years is to gradually reduce those fiscal deficits. Let me turn to the second key ingredient of a stronger potential GDP, and that is the quality of the labor force. The most obvious aspect of labor force quality is education, and here Korea has excelled. A quality labor force requires basic skills, literacy, and numeracy. In Korea, 98% of the population at age 15 can read and write. So 98% are literate, a very high global standard. But a productive labor force in a modern economy requires more than that. It requires higher education as well. And so it's very impressive that students entering primary school in Korea expect to spend an average of 17 years in school. That is, to finish high school and to go on for several years of higher education. That is more years of schooling than experienced in Germany, France, Japan, or the United States. And let's be honest, education requires more than just going to school. You also have to work hard, to study hard. And anyone who has worked with Korean students, as I have at Harvard, knows that they work very hard indeed. A quality labor force requires ongoing education and training, on-the-job training, and experience that adds to skills. Again, Korea seems to do this very well in its major firms. And as with education, a quality workforce must also be a hard-working labor force. And once again, my impression is that Korean workers are indeed very hard-working. But there is one problem about the Korean labor force. It's really a problem of national demographics. The fertility rate here in Korea is very low, only about 1.2 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. It actually takes 2.2, nearly twice as many as the Korean standard, 2.2 children per woman, just to maintain the size of the population. So there's a serious likelihood that over the years ahead, the Korean population will actually shrink if policies are not adopted to increase the fertility rate. The third source of potential GDP growth is technology. Everyone recognizes Korea as a major high-tech country. This reflects the provision of good technical education and of government policies to encourage high-tech industries. At an earlier stage in Korea's development, the government explicitly encouraged such technology and backed particular industries. But now Korean industry builds on this earlier momentum. The government can continue to help through education policies that encourage and train the labor force needed for high-tech industry. It can also help by providing, supporting basic research that the private sector cannot support. Some industrial countries think that the government can usefully raise growth by industrial policies that subsidize certain industries. I doubt that. The evidence that I have seen suggests that such policies divert resources and activities into less productive uses. I turn finally to the fourth ingredient needed for successful long-term growth, and that is good management. A country can have a high savings rate, a well-educated labor force, and access to the best technology, but it won't grow without skilled management to put those pieces together, to drive innovation and efficiency and productivity. Korea's growth suggests that it has developed such good managers. Some might say, though, that with the very high saving rate here and the quality of the labor force, Korea should actually be growing even faster and could do so if it had better managers. I don't know how to produce better managers, and I certainly don't know the policies that the government might adopt to do it. Certainly high tax rates on the salaries of top managers would be harmful. But at the risk of being wrong, let me make one comment about Korean management as I see it. In contrast to other countries, Korean managements, Korean boards of directors, are almost exclusively drawn from within the country. My experience in U.S. companies is that they recruit executives from around the world in order to get the best people and to infuse new ideas. Until now, I've been talking about the 4 ingredients needed for sustained long-term growth. But my assignment today is not only to deal with sustained long-term growth, but also with cyclical stability that supports stable employment. Experience teaches us that there are 3 basic sources of economic downturns that cause increases in unemployment. That is, that cause actual GDP to be less than potential GDP. The 3 causes of those downturns can be summarized as external shocks, domestic reactions to overinvestment, and excessive monetary tightening to deal with inflation. So let me comment briefly on each of these. And I'll start with external shocks. Because exports are a major part of production here in Korea, the Korean economy is sensitive to fluctuations in GDP in the rest of the world. The recent downturn here in Korea was caused by that kind of global downturn. There is, of course, little that can be done to prevent that kind of downturn. Diversification of markets can help, although it can't help when all other countries are turning down. So a country has to be prepared to offset some of the negative demand shock with domestic monetary and fiscal policy. That's actually harder than it sounds. Domestic buyers don't want the same products that exporters sell, and it is difficult to respond quickly enough. So the best policies are to provide temporary relief for those individuals who are adversely affected. More can be done to prevent the adverse effect of changes in the exchange rate. In the late 1990s, as many of you will remember, Korean banks had loaned dollars to domestic firms and financed those loans on the international market. Foreign creditors recognized this mismatch and sought repayment from the banks. When the banks couldn't collect dollars from their domestic firms, foreign speculators attacked the Korean won. That led to the currency crisis in the late 1990s, followed by the IMF's repressive policies. That sequence of events can be prevented by a combination of policies: accumulating large amounts of foreign exchange so speculators have no incentive to attack the currency, avoiding an overvalued currency, and not allowing the domestic banks to get into a mismatched position, lending large amounts of dollars to domestic firms. I hope that after the devastating experience in the late 1990s and the close call here last year, this lesson has been learned. This brings me to the second cause of business cycle downturns, and that is domestic overinvestment. A common problem in many countries is overinvestment in plant and equipment or business inventories. Once firms recognize that they have done excessive investment, they cut back, and that causes the economy to turn down. But the third cause of economic downturns, and the most common in many countries, including the United States, is monetary tightening by the central bank. Time and again, the U.S. central bank allowed inflation pressures to develop. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, then raised the real short-term interest rate to prevent higher inflation or to reverse the rise in inflation that had already occurred. And those high real interest rates caused a collapse of investment in construction, pushing the economy into recession. So the lesson there is very clear. Policy should act sooner to prevent the increased inflation so that very substantial subsequent tightening can be avoided. Well, let me conclude now by restating that the global economic scene now faces substantial challenges to increase and sustain strong growth and to avoid the cyclical instability that raises unemployment. Korea has done an outstanding job over many decades, and I'm confident that it will continue to do so in the years ahead. Thank you very much. Now I'm very happy to take questions until our moderator tells me I can't take any more. So I'm ready for the first question. There must be people with microphones out there to help.
Any questions from the floor?
I've answered all questions about all subjects.
Professor? How about gentleman over there? Could you wait for loading microphone?
So I can see somebody over here waiting for a microphone. I don't see anybody with a microphone.
Maybe he could just stand up and shout it.
Are there microphones? Oh, here comes someone to the rescue. The questioner is over here. It's a big auditorium.
Firstly, thank you for your lecture. Should I stand up? Or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
No, stand up.
Okay. Thank you for Professor Martin. You mentioned about for some important thing to improve something. I would like to ask you about the labor force. In Korea, actually, there is a lot of people, a lot of young people. They graduate very high education. It's some people say it's overqualification. Actually, some area we don't need the high, some certificated people, such as we don't need the bachelor degree at the McDonald's. So at the rural area, there are the first industry. So still young people, they don't want to work at some rural area as a farmer. And there is a trend. It's the farmer, they marry with some international people, and we hired from the other country as just a worker. So I just want to ask you about some Korean policy about the education. It's don't you think it's too much educated?
So I understand the question, and I understand where you're coming from, but I think Korea has benefited enormously from the policy of extensive education, of complete literacy, and of people who graduate from high school going on to university. Now, there are questions about what subjects people study, and it's very important that the labor force work well to absorb people with different skills. But I would, the last thing I would recommend is cutting back on education. I think education has been one of the things that has contributed so much to the growth of the Korean economy.
Since there is any questions from the floor, let me ask one questions. You mentioned about 4 ingredients of sustainable economic growth, and also you talk about 3 causes of economic downturn, and you are worrying about the double dip, risk of double dip recession in the U.S. Do you think the stimulus package of U.S. is big enough and good enough to cope with the current situation?
I worry, you and I have had a chance to talk privately before, so you know that I worry that there is a serious risk that the U.S. economy could have a so-called double dip, that we could not only slow down in 2010, but that we might see the economy turn down again temporarily. I think that the fiscal stimulus has contributed to the recovery that has already occurred in 2009, but the fiscal stimulus will no longer be expanding when we get to 2010. And so with other things coming down, with spending on net exports shrinking, with spending by state and local governments shrinking, with business investments still getting weak, unless we have a strong increase from consumers, I think there is a serious risk that the economy will run out of steam and actually turn down. Let me emphasize that you shouldn't go away and say, I heard Marty Feldstein and he's predicting that the U.S. economy is going to turn down next year. I'm not making that prediction. What I'm saying is that there is a high risk that that could happen, and anybody, whether they're a business manager or a personal investor or a government, has to think about not just the most likely outcome, not certainly the most favorable outcome, but the risks of different things. And I think there is a significant risk of a downturn in the year ahead.
Just receive one more question.
There's a question here in the front row.
Gentleman over there.
Well, you can see better than I.
Well, thank you very much. I read recently that some people think that prices of stocks, gold and other commodities have been increasing too highly and too rapidly, and that could create a bubble that could explode and create a second financial crisis. What do you think about this?
Well, the last thing I want to do is give you or anybody else advice about the stock market, but with that caveat in mind, I think that the stock market is assuming implicitly that the economy is going to do very well in the United States next year. And it's also being driven by the very low interest rates. As investors seek something, they turn to the stock market or to gold. So I think that there are risks that as interest rates rise, as the economy slows, there will be disappointments. And we could see a retrenchment both in equity prices and in the prices of some of the speculative assets like gold. But don't rush out and invest on that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was an honor again to be with you all.
Our next speaker is Professor Harry Kites. Professor Harry Kites is the Dean of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University, and Jack Scheichman, Professor of Collective Bargaining. Professor Kites received his PhD in economics from University of California, Berkeley in 1977, and BA economics from the same university in 1973. After teaching at MIT, he came to Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations in 1985. Dean Katz's research has focused on new structure for labor management relations in the U.S., and his work argues the need for more cooperative system. He's expert on labor relations in automobile and telecommunication industries, both in the U.S. and abroad. Dean Katz is the author of several well-respected books, including Shifting Gears, Changing Labor Relations in the U.S. Automobile Industry, The Transportation of American Industrial Relations, Converging Divergence, Worldwide Change in Employment System, and the widely used textbook on Introduction to Collective Bargaining and Industrial Relations. Please welcome Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My university, Cornell University, and the school I teach at, the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, has many strong ties to Korea, and it's a delight to return to Korea. In particular, we have many students from Korea who come to Cornell and study at the undergraduate and graduate level. We admire their tenacity and their work ethic, as Professor Feldstein has commented. You're distinguished in that regard, and it's a pleasure for me to be back in Seoul to see many of my former students. My role is in part to present the other end of the spectrum from that discussed by Professor Feldstein. He emphasized the broad macroeconomic factors that can influence economic growth, and I'm here to talk about more micro and even workplace issues that influence economic growth. So bear with me if you've got your head tuned into macro issues. I want you to shift gears and focus all the way down to the workplace, to the relationship between workers and managers. My remarks will focus on particular workplace practices in 3 dimensions, but before I get to each of those dimensions, there's a consistent theme I want to emphasize, and that is that there's a need to balance both markets and institutions. Institutions are regulations, structures that guide practices. And I think we actually have a macroeconomic lesson that unfortunately came from the recent financial crisis as to why we need to balance markets and institutions. Clearly, market pressures alone, as we've learned in the financial crisis, need to be tempered by institutional constraints and structures. At the same time, not only American experience, but really world experience has shown that institutions that are insensitive to markets are doomed to failure. And so thus the lesson is that we need to balance markets and institution. No simple matter, and I'm going to talk a bit about how to balance markets and institutions with regard to labor market policies. Now, I'm going to focus on 3 areas. One is skill development, because that's the primary topic of this conference, but also go on and give some illustrations in 2 other workplace issues. One is dispute resolution and mediation procedures, and the other is work organizations, including team-based systems, how work is managed, again, at the very micro workplace level. In each of these arenas, my point is going to be that we need to balance markets and institutions, and I'll try and suggest how that can be done. With regard to skill development, I think one of the key observations to note at the micro level is that in recent years we've seen higher interfirm turnover, employees moving more frequently between firms, both because of unemployment and also because of the dynamic nature of global economic conditions. That has led to a weakening of internal labor markets, ILMs, as we refer to them in the research literature, and also a reduction in private incentives to invest in education and training because employees might well spend less time attached to any particular firm, so that reduces the incentives for private investment. So what we need is to find ways to find an appropriate balance and mix between both private and public investments in education and training. And what I would emphasize is that in recent years have shown the advantages to consortiums, to clusters or combinations of both private and public partnerships, firms joining together at a regional or sectoral level and promoting skill development. We've seen this emerge in the telecommunications industry, providing those many network technicians that we all need to operate not only the landline but the increasingly mobile and more advanced communications we rely on. We also see the value of these kinds of consortiums in the healthcare sector, in training the nurses and other healthcare professionals. We see clusters of hospitals where each hospital on its own may not have either the incentive or the skill to develop an appropriate training agenda. Those agendas can be effectively promoted through consortium. Now, at the workplace level, I'll remind you that there's a very difficult question which isn't so easily answered by merely increasing the amount of money spent on training, and that is the answer to the question, training for what? Again, research has shown that often money can be spent on training, well-intentioned as it may be, but in fact it is not attuned to where skill demands are going, what future skill needs are, but rather is often responding to past needs, and that's not an effective balance of markets and institutions. With regard to dispute resolution and mediation, I'll use the word ADR, alternative dispute resolution, to emphasize the fact that what we see appearing not only in the United States and not only in other Western countries, but also in Asian and Latin American countries, is a spread of conflict resolution mechanisms that are outside of, different than the traditional mechanisms which have been used. The traditional mechanisms are often legalistic, litigation to solve conflicts that arise at the workplace, or grievance procedures, a word adapted from the US, internal complaint procedures within a firm. And the parties have been searching for alternatives to those traditional mechanisms because the traditional mechanisms can be both too slow and, of course, too costly. And what we've seen is a critical role for informed mediators, knowledgeable individuals who understand the workplace, but can also act responsively to social and legal concerns without all the costly trappings of litigation and court structures. Now, what I'll emphasize here is a connection to the main theme of the conference, that meeting the needs of finding mediators is in part an education function. There isn't enough education of the parties directly involved concerning the roles that mediators can play and the innovations that have developed in how mediation can be used. And similarly, there aren't enough good mediators around. There aren't enough people who have that appropriate balance, that skill mix in understanding the practical workplace concerns, but also providing a broad and at times a social perspective. I'd also remind you that mediation and conflict resolution is not just something that we need or that we see the demand for in union settings. It's not the union that brings the need for mediation. There are workplace disputes whether or not unions are present. They're often harder to find, harder to see in non-union settings, but they're there. And so there's a need for these alternative forms in the non-union settings as well as union, and we actually see, the research has shown, a wide variety of new experiments and develops in this very form of settlement and compromise in non-union as well as union settings. I'd also add, and it's very appropriate when one comes to Korea to discuss this, but it's not just a Korean phenomena, is that in recent years, somewhat surprisingly to many, we've seen an expansion in social or tripartite levels of interaction between labor and management. And again, I would argue one of the key needs is to develop effective mediators and third parties that can assist that tripartite conflict resolution. The third area I want to mention, just again as a further illustration, of the need to balance markets and institutions deals with work organization, how employees work in a very specific, concrete way at the workplace level. There's continuing evidence that productivity and service quality can be enhanced through team-based systems of work. That research derives not only from the automobile industry, also from telecommunications, and as many examples from healthcare. Now, what we've seen in recent years is, of course, a lot of very difficult economic times at the workplace level, plant closings, layoffs, employment contractions, and those difficulties often overwhelm and create adverse reactions to participation in team systems. And I think that's the challenge for the parties, to institutionalize processes that can survive the pressures of adverse economic conditions. Again, just quickly, to tie it back to the theme of this conference, we need more education and training, both about the nature of team systems and training for the specific individuals who can be involved in leading the development of those structures. The last thing I'll mention is that at least my own research shows the virtues of looking at comparative developments across countries. And what I observe, or what I've referred to as converging divergences, those are strange words not only because they're not translated into Korean, they're even strange words in English. So just very briefly, what the evidence shows is widening variation within countries' employment systems, more diversity in those employment systems. That's due to both the intense international competition, the growth of non-union alternatives to union systems, and that creates more divergences. Along the way, we see more individualization and decentralization in employment systems. We see similarities in countries, and that's the converging part of the story, and that's why we see both what, again, I refer to as convergences and divergences. Last but not least, one of the unfortunate side effects of the increasing divergences is increased income and social polarization, inequality in income. So my last point, again, is just to remind you of the theme I've tried to argue for. We need to find ways to balance markets and institutions. That's a critical question at the workplace level, just as it is with regard to more macroeconomic concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Katz. His presentation is so clear and stimulating. I don't think I need to summarize his presentations. Our final speaker is William Swope. William Swope is a corporate vice president and general manager of Intel's corporate sustainability group. In this role, he is responsible for driving Intel's environmental efforts in the area of policy, operation, and products. Swope works with the stakeholders across the company to ensure that Intel continues to build up its industrial leadership in sustainability. Dr. Swope, please.
So, a complete change of topic from the first two speakers. A country requires energy in order to produce jobs. And we have to couple that with the climate change and the issues that I think most of us in the room have internalized. Those would appear to be in conflict. This talk is going to try to take you through a very convoluted series of logic to show you that the real strength of a society is its ability to engineer itself into a sustainable series of environments. So the talk was, buy a bit and save a watt. Fundamental message that you give to large audiences, you keep everything very, very simple and straightforward, and the foils are always clean and they're in context. I'm taking a big chance with my first foil. It's not at all clean and it's complex. But please stay with this first idea, and then I hope it will make sense over the next 15 minutes. So be ready. This is the actual data of the energy use within the United States in the year 2008. There is one simple point to be made, but it will take me about 1 minute to make it. On the left are all the sources of energy: petroleum, coal, natural gas, solar, wind. And on the right are those uses of it in transportation and industry, commercial and residential. And the width of the line just shows the amount of energy that's moving. So although the foil is very complex, if you just think about it just in terms of the colors, what you get is transportation takes a huge amount. Most of it's done from petroleum. Coal is a very large source of energy for the United States, and most of it goes into power generation, right? But what's the message on the foil that really matters? The message on the foil that matters is on the far, far right, where it says energy served and energy rejected. In America, 40% of the energy we consume is used, and 60% is thrown away. 40% is used, 60% is thrown away. That's pretty dramatic if you're trying to do things to reduce your energy consumption. Now let's look at the other major message. 2% of the world's energy is consumed by computers. And 2% of a big number is still a big number. 2%. 98% is consumed on the chart that I just showed you. And of that 98%, 60% of that, right, virtually 60% of the total, is not used productively. It, in essence, is it's unused, returned, wasted. So if you really think about it, the real message that we have is that computers that consume 2% of the world's energy really can help take that 98% and deal with the 60% inefficiency in the 98%. There's a huge amount of engineering that has to take place to do that, but that is true sustainable growth, because what you are doing is taking the same amount of carbon resource in terms of the energy that you have in country, and you're making it far more productive, therefore allowing job growth while reducing your carbon footprint. Korea, I believe, is the most aggressive modern society that's taken a goal of carbon reduction, of footprint reduction, i.e., the amount of carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere, 20% by 2012. Now, some of that might be masked by the downturn, but it's still an incredibly aggressive goal. The United States is not there yet. To do that, I assure you the first and foremost place to go get that energy that reduction in footprint, reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide created, is in making all of your processes more efficient. That's what can happen tomorrow. That will stimulate immediate job growth. And think about it in these three ways. One of which is automation. May go against what you'd first think of human resource, but as the first professor said pretty clearly, capital actually drives increases in productivity and increases in jobs. The second thing, if you look at that same thing for automation, smart buildings, smart power, what you hear about smart grid, all of those things fit in that first category over there. The second is substitution. We just did a study for what it really takes to produce a compact disc versus what it takes in terms of energy versus what it takes to take that same music and transport it over the network and download it as a file, whether it be an MP3 file or one of the better compression mechanisms, right? It's dramatically different. What you're substituting is a physical thing, a CD, for the electronic equivalent of that thing, which is the data file, right? A music file. That's far more efficient. Cisco just said they were going to reduce their travel in 2010 by $750 million because they produce video conferencing equipment, and they were going to use their own equipment. And they were not going to travel. They were going to do video conferencing. Korea has about the strongest backbone of any country in the world in the amount of fiber and data transmission that you have in country, right? So again, you go back to that efficiency of jobs and efficiency of automation, and that would be in the video conferencing area. That would be in the substitution area. And the third major place to go after that 60% of unuse is using the computer instead of the physical instantiation. The common joke on this would be it's an awful lot less expensive to teach someone to fly an airplane on a simulator than it is to immediately start having them fly the actual plane because of the obvious issues associated with plane flight, right? You can make a lot of mistakes in a simulator and still have a cup of coffee afterwards. If you think about that for a carbon footprint, however, that begins to make a lot more sense, right? In fact, if you take a look at just building a building, not only is there the intelligence to control the building, but there's a computer program now that says, if I would have turned the building 5% one way or the other on the lot, would it have consumed more or less energy because of its thermal footprint to the sun? In fact, what would have been the optimum angle to have set the building at? And no matter how much that computer costs to run or how many kilowatts of power that computer consumed, it won't come close to the amount of energy savings by getting that building optimized on its lot location for reducing the energy that it takes to either heat it or cool it. Right? So that entire area of the third area of dematerialization basically is that kind of intellectual substitution and knowledge of modeling. There are many such examples of this. When you get done with those three areas, what you end up with is examples like what a smart building is. And you say, what would be all of these technologies put together, and how would it help to go after that inefficiency in energy? And if you guys are agreeing with me, if you take the total amount of energy a country has, you can maximize the number of jobs you can create on any given amount of energy by not throwing away as much energy. And here what you get is, again, I won't use the laser because you won't be able to see it in the back of the room, but at least in the United States, buildings take about half of the total amount of energy in the United States. So making a building more efficient is a great thing to do. Computers all over this problem, right? Because of heating, cooling, even cleaning and circulation, let alone the original placement of the building. All of these things are places that computers can help on, right? Let alone if the building's doing something. A data center would be this to an extreme, right? Where you not only have this building that in and of itself consumes power, but of course the energy does as well. Right? The challenge here is to think about a smart grid inside of a building and then think of a smart grid across a country and realize one is just the larger version of the smaller, and all of these things can be made far more efficient over time. Finally, what you get to is you say, as I Korea is right now the role model of the world in terms of taking this goal aggressively. And what's it going to mean to actually achieve it and then go beyond it? The way I kind of thought about it was there's a closed virtuous circle in terms of actually making sustainable jobs. Whatever, you've got to start with a goal, and that goal has to be backed with policy, and then capital, and then public education and involvement. Because fundamental to all this is the world has to kind of agree, at least your society has to agree of where you're trying to go and why, right? That revolves in a series of actions. Those have to be rewarded. Those have to be measured. In order to pull back, you could swap measurement and rewards. I had that debate internally. And then you go back and you reset your goal, right? But the net result of that is behavior change. A computer can help you in this area by giving you the data. A computer can help by making it more efficient. But fundamentally, in the next couple of years, no matter what else we try to do for energy generation, we're not going to be able to create enough wind energy or enough solar energy or enough geothermal energy to make a meaningful difference. That doesn't say in the long term we can't. In the long term, I think a lot of us have hope that that will happen. But in the short term, our job is to become more efficient in the use of the energy we're already creating. Computers can be handy in that area. In fact, they're the #1 tool for making that happen. And as a result, they are the #1 tool that can create sustainable jobs in the short term. Thank you.
In this session, we covered three quite different subjects, global financial crisis, and labor relationship, and also energy. So it's not easy to discuss and make comments on the issues. But anyway, we have two distinguished discussants. Let me ask first Dr. Laspal Malhotra. Dr. Laspal Malhotra is the founder and director of Center for Research in Rural and Industrial Development in India. Would you make comments, please?
The first presentation attracted my attention, and I would like to share that with you. What we in India have been looking at it, some of the issues which was discussed by the first speaker, and that is sustainability, stability. Now, sustainability itself needs to identify what are the sustaining factors to sustain the sustainability. The thing which I wanted to share with you is, and this is what my teacher and my boss, the leading economist, Dr. Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India, who has been heading my institute also, he is of the view that sustainability and stability come from peace and development. If there is a peace, then there is development, and what comes out of it is sustainability and stability. If there is no peace, there is no development. And if there is no development, there is no peace. So this is one thing which we in India have been stressing upon, that sustainability is not an independent indicator. It is a dependent indicator. And then it is linked with the question of security. Now, these things are interrelated. So I was very happy to listen to the first speaker. He made a very educative presentation. But the context has to be expanded. It has to be expanded for the simple reason that in today's world, sustainability and stability are born out of the peace, and peace for development and development for peace, which eventually bring in security to sustain as a sustaining factor both of stability and sustainability and stability. That's one. The other thing is, you make investment. Now in India we have, the second point which I want to make, Mr. Chairman, and first of all, thank you very much for having thought of me from India, and I am really very grateful to you, and I'll say this tomorrow when I make my presentation. but I am overwhelmed by your hospitality, the wonderful arrangements, the dedication of your team. I can't help it because I'm an Indian and we are very emotional people like you. So I am just intervening in my own presentation of these few minutes to say that I'm deeply impressed the efficiency, the courtesy, and the manner in which the whole thing has been conducted. And I want to convey my thanks to all the members of your team who have been working with you. Now, second part is, which I wanted to say, the issue which we have been talking in India is whether you invest to create employment or the employment gets generated by virtue of investment. Now, if it is an employment which is getting created by virtue of investment, it is a process which will go on and it will become sustainable. But if you are investing money in order to create employment, which has been happening in India, it was a short-lived phenomena. What we have now done is, and this Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who is a leading economist and who is very close to your setup here, we have a special relationship with South Korea, India has, and he is responsible for it, and your Prime Minister, President. Now, if the investment is being made to create employment, that's short-lived. But if the employment is getting generated because of the investment factor being the basic which is generating employment, that is a long-term phenomena. Now, for example, in India, we have recently, and this is Prime Minister's and the Madam Sonia Gandhi, who is the President of the party, the idea, we have introduced a scheme called National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Now, this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has enabled the unskilled or even skilled laborer to get assured employment for 100 days, which means that he was previously migrating from the states or from the areas which were not fully developed and was going to the areas which were developed and seeking employment, particularly in the agriculture sector, construction, and the non-formal sector. As a result of this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the migration has stopped, resulting into the manpower being available there on the ground within the area one is living, and this has stopped an unnecessary burden on the cities which were developing slums, because in India, you know, it's, after China is the heaviest heavily populated country with I think a little more than 1 billion people there. So this scheme now, we are looking at it that this is a means to an end, and that's why this relates to my first point, that if you are investing to create an employment, that is short-lived phenomena. But if the employment is taking place as a result of investment, that is a long-term phenomena. So what we see in India, this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, as a short-term phenomena to ensure, of course, one thing is that the roads, the buildings, the agriculture is providing the services and the migration has stopped. But the other thing is, it is a means to an end. It is not an end by itself. So therefore, anything which any country undertakes, and the Korea's record is remarkable, but about that I'll talk about it tomorrow in my small presentation. What we need to perhaps look at it, you see, there's the third point, and that's my last point, as a reaction to, as a response to this excellent presentation of first speaker, the other two gentlemen who have spoken. I was learning a lot. In fact, one has to unlearn to learn what my friend here and Professor Harry has said it. So I have nothing to say, but the last point I want to react to is, the third point is, you see, there has been an attempt in India, and that is, let us have a short-term plan. And so it was attempted, you had short-term plan, which as a result of continuity and the evolutionary process, it became a long-term plan. So subsequently, the planners and other experts came to the view that no, and I was one of the votary of that, there is no short-term plan. Short-term plan must emerge from a long-term plan. You have a large canvas, and you can make a small beginning, which you can call a short beginning. You can make a small beginning, but a well thought out beginning. But it should be a part of a bigger plan. It should be a part of a wider plan. Because once you have a wider plan, there are multidisciplinary constraints, there are multidisciplinary approaches to tackle a problem. Because in a world in which we are living, nothing can be thought with a single discipline. So finally what I want to conclude is that there is no short-term gain or planning of any program. It has to be a broad term. As far as your thinking goes, as far as your expertise supports you, you plan it. Plan a bigger, have a wider canvas. And within that canvas, then you pinpoint, okay, these are the resources available with me, these are the resources with constraints, these are the resources without constraints. Therefore, I go ahead with those which are constraint-free. And that is a part of your long-term plan. But thinking of a short-term plan is not something which is being favored, at least in my country. And sir, I thank you once again, and the other two brilliant speakers. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Dr. Laspal Malhotra. Our next discussant is Wei-Ping Fang. He's a professor of School of Economics, Renmin University of China. He used to be the chairman of the Department of International Economics and dean of the School of Economics. Professor Fang, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure that I give some comments to our distinguished presenter. And in my mind, sustainability, on the one hand, is a kind of pattern of development. On the other hand, it's a kind of the philosophy. Sustainability, first, that means efficiency. The people would like to consume less of the natural resources and to produce more. That means what? That means efficiency. That means research. That means progress. But on the other hand, that means what? That means the human being got very good relations with the nature. You use the natural resources to survive the people, to get better off. You should, you see, consume less and produce more. So the first thing, sustainability, means efficiency. And the second, on the one hand, that means the production should benefit everyone in this planet. That means what? That means advantage of development should be shared by everyone to all of the people in this world. This is, you see, economically speaking. On the other hand, that means harmonization among people. If, you see, with the production, we produce more and more, but some people get richer and richer, but some in this world get poorer and poorer. Why people should to produce more? So in this case, on the one hand, you see, that means the benefit should be shared by all of the people in this world. This is the kind of the philosophy, harmonization among the people. The third thing that you see our speakers mentioned, that means green economy. Everything should be greenized. We should greenize production. We should greenize kinds of the consumption. Not only for the energy, but for all the production, we should get greenized. And for consumption also in that way. For today, this is what? Philosophically speaking, that means the good relationship between or among the generations. The older generation should save more environmental kind of things, the natural resources, to leave for the next generation. That means a good relation between you and your grandson, your grandgirl. This is very important. You could not use up the natural resources existed now and left nothing to your next generation. So in this case, the green economy, very important, not only for our generation, but also for the next generation. So in this case, I just mentioned three things: efficiency, and for all people shared benefit, and finally, the last but not the least, the good relations between or among the generations. All the things got combination in my mind. That means sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fang. Since time is rather limited, I'll take just one or two questions from the floor. Any questions from floor? Gentleman over there.
Thank you. I'm Amante from Hanyang University. And we're lucky that at last we have one speaker from industrial relations. I teach industrial, and somehow there has been a divergence between HR and industrial relations. And it's sometimes difficult to explain, but now I think there is increasing importance. And I hope that next year there will be more discussions about the topic that Professor Katz had just mentioned. And the World Forum report this year from Davos, Global Competitiveness, mentioned Korea's weaknesses in this field, actually. But of course, that would be the viewpoint of the employer, of the business. And G20 mentioned something about decent work. So I am wondering about your views on this one. Of course, you could still own or disown the Katz, Koch and McKinsey model, very famous model of industrial relations. And my second question is, what do you think about, you see, in the Korea-US FTA, I think one issue is about auto unions in US complaining about Korean cars. But of course, now with the Obama administration emphasizing rights at work. And so next year, how do we follow this up? And of course, I would be interested to hear your views about these two things. Decent work in the G20 statement, how we follow it up, and your views about what auto workers unions in US complain about Korean cars. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Katz, would you respond to him?
Sure, just briefly. I think Korea has a healthy and dynamic industrial relations system. It's one that's evolved particularly dramatically over the last 20 years. I don't think it's necessarily finished its evolution, but I think it actually has a very healthy dynamic. It has independent unions that express their will and their voice. They don't always agree with management, but it's important to democracy to have such an independent voice. You have a strong tradition of workplace representation complemented by tripartite discussions. Those discussions at times can be frustrating, but it's healthy that they exist. So, I actually think as a U.S. observer that there's a lot of healthy dynamic evolution occurring in your system. The second point, the critique of American workers, U.S. workers' critique of conditions in Korea. You know, my view is it's up to Koreans and Korean society to set their employment system. It's not my place or anyone's place outside Korea to decide what characteristics you want to evolve and where you want to lie across various dimensions. And I respect the decisions. I think that's, those of us in the field of industrial relations inherently believe that the parties themselves who work under conditions should be the ones to set those conditions. So I would defend your right to determine your system. You know, I could be displeased by the outcomes, but also respectful of your rights to determine those outcomes.
Thank you, Professor Kites. As you know, the theme of this session was growth, sustainability, and stability of society for job creations. 3 speakers and 2 discussants approached this theme from different angles. I feel this session is very productive and stimulating. Since this conference is a little bit behind the schedule, I think it's time to wrap up this session. Please give big hands for 3 speakers and 2 discussants.
And also a big hand to our moderator, Mr. Kim In-jun, the president of the Korean Economic Association. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And now maybe all of you would have received this opinion poll by now. It is both in Korean and in English. And also to help us grow even more for the advancement of this forum, we would like to hear your opinions. So please write them down before you leave this room. We are going to take a break now, as this is the end of our second plenary session. And we're going to have a coffee break for about 15 minutes. And we'll be back with the third plenary session. We'll be seeing you all back shortly. Thank you very much.